Good evening, everyone. I first have got to make an announcement, and this is under instruction, and that is that there's no fire alarm. So if you smell burning or something like this, take it seriously and go downstairs and out the normal way. There'll be no fire alarm. Let me now introduce the second Burton R Clark lecture and the second Burton Clark lecturer. And perhaps for those of you who don't know me, my name is Mike Shattock, and I'm a member of the Institute and of the Centre for Global Higher Education. I was also an old friend and colleague of Bob Clark's, and I want to say a little bit about him as a way of opening the lecture. Bob died in 2009 and was one of the founders of the study of higher education. First as a professor of the sociology of organizations at Yale, and subsequently as the Alan Carter Professor of Higher Education at UCLA. He was one of that very remarkable group of American scholars, Bob Badal, Clark Kerr, David Reisman, Sheldon Rothblack, Edward Shills, and Martin Troe, who in the post-war years created the field of higher education and rode the crest of the wave of expansion which made such an enormous social and economic impact in the US. But Clark stood out, and he continued to do so after his retirement in 1992 because of his commitment to research and to producing a stream of major books. What's striking about his bibliography is his range from community colleges to liberal arts colleges to the academic oligarchy in Italy, to his masterpiece, The Higher Education System, published in 1983, to studies of the impact of disciplines on the shape of institutions, to his two books on graduate schools and research, and to his late interest in entrepreneurialism in higher education. Clark was one of the few scholars who engaged the interests of policymakers as much as other scholars, and whose work was as widely read outside the US as inside, and particularly in Britain, and particularly within the higher education group in the Institute of Education. Clark's last book was a selected collection of writings stretching from 1956 to 2006, edited by his wife Adele and Patricia Gumport. And it's to his wife, Adele, to whom I should now like to turn, because it was her generosity which endowed this lecture series at the Institute. She can't be with us today, as she was for the first lecture last year because of illness, but I hope you'll join me in wishing her a full recovery. Let me now turn to our lecturer, Professor Ellen Hazelkorn. It's difficult to imagine a better choice of someone to deliver this lecture. She's both a distinguished scholar and a policymaker. A former dean of the Graduate Research School at the Dublin Institute of Technology and director of the research unit on higher education there, she's now a policy advisor to the Irish Higher Education Authority, past president of EAIR, and frequently called on by OECD and other organizations to undertake reviews of national higher education systems, her most recent being of Welsh higher education for the Welsh Government. But more relevant to us today is her reputation as a scholar. She is the authority on the impact of league tables on higher education, from her breakthrough book, Rankings and the Reshaping of Higher Education in 2011. to her Global Rankings and Geopolitics of Higher Education in 2016. And in that year, 2016, she produced two other books, one on arts and humanities research and the other on the civic university. She's a scholar at the peak of her game. Let me now ask her to deliver her lecture, Rankings and Higher Education, Reframing Relationships with and Between States. Ellen.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Good evening, and it's a bit less sunny than when I left Dublin yesterday, but it's still nice, and I gather the weather will be nice for the rest of the week. We always talk about the weather in Ireland. It seems to be the feature of the conversation. I'd like to start by certainly welcoming all of you and by thanking Simon Martinson and Untitled Clark for their invitation to speak at this second Burton R Clark lecture, and to Mike Shattock for his kind comments. It's truly an honor. I first met Bob many years ago, I'd say maybe about 15 years ago or so, at an AIR conference he was in. We were all sitting around at kind of picnic tables. I think you might have been there also, Mike. And then a bit more recently than that, but also equally far back, when he visited Ireland, and we went for dinner with my new president. He was just coming and starting his office. I thought he might gain some insights by talking with Bob about presidents and systems and things of that sort. So I would also like to extend my thanks to Caroline Gallup and to Anna Phillips for their help from the Center for Global Higher Education, for their assistance in helping putting this together, and of course all of you for coming this evening. I'm going to talk for about an hour about this issue of rankings in higher education, looking at reframing relationships within and between states. So to start, higher education is a global enterprise. Its success or failure is integral to and a powerful indicator of the knowledge-producing and talent-attracting capacity of nations. But the landscape in which higher education operates today has become extremely complex. There are many more demands and many constituencies, the latter often with conflicting opinions, which have an impact now and a voice shaping higher education's role and purpose. Since the millennium, university rankings have become one of these influencing voices, no longer simply about enhancing student choice, but more about geopolitical positioning for nations and for universities. While not always or directly responsible for many of the policy actions or options or institutional decisions, rankings are undoubtedly an accelerator of reform and a prominent part of the policy assemblages. In this respect, they've succeeded in changing the discourse around knowledge, society, and the economy, and reframing the relationship of higher education within and between states. Bob Clark was, as Mike says, well-known, a world-class leader in organizational sociology. His book, The Higher Education System, Academic Organization and Cross-National Perspectives, 1983, provided an important entree into this complex world of higher education relationships. But that world has changed considerably since the days he first wrote. And if he was writing today, he would have had to have engaged with these issues in ways that arguably weren't necessary or relevant in 1983. There's 4 parts to my talk today. One, I'll reflect initially on my own journey, which has taken me from looking at rankings as a management and benchmarking tool influencing institutional decision-making to being a strategic instrument reflecting and driving competition at institutional, national, and global levels, as well as being a lens into globalized higher education. In the second part, I'll consider 2 cross-cutting themes or dimensions which have helped reframe the relationships between higher education and the state. 1, the accountability agenda, and 2, the increasingly geopolitical nature of higher education. Then I'll reflect on Clark's triangle of coordination. I'll briefly discuss what it tells us about higher education's relationship to the state and other policy actors, and consider the extent to which these reframed relationships modify his model. And then finally, I want to conclude with some thoughts about the implications of what this means for higher education today, especially in the context of recent political developments. So reflecting on rankings and their influence. I first started looking seriously at the issue of rankings over 10 years ago. I'd been working with the OECD since 2001 and had previously completed a study of the development of research capacity in new universities. By 2006, global rankings had been around a few years, but it was clear they were already having quite an impact on what governments and university presidents thought about higher education and its place in the world. So with the support of the OECD, the International Association of Universities, and later the Institute of Higher Education Policy based in Washington, I began an international study of the influence and impact of rankings on higher education policy and academic decision-making. Over the years, I've traversed the globe many times, meeting and talking with political leaders and policymakers, university presidents and vice chancellors, faculty, senior administrators, and students, learning firsthand how rankings are impacting on higher education and influencing or not government policymaking, institutional decision-making, and academic behavior. I'd first heard officially about global rankings at an EU conference I attended in Liège in Belgium in April 2004. Titled The Europe of Knowledge 2020, A Vision for University-Based Research and Innovation, conference documentation expressed fears that, quote, Europe's universities may not be best equipped to respond to the challenges facing higher education in the 21st century. This concern has to be understood in the context of the goals of Lisbon and Barcelona and Europe's strive for becoming the most competitive knowledge society in the world, end quotes. The conference was an action of the modernization program for higher education in Europe. In addition to the usual referencing of higher education's role in the knowledge economy, what was particularly striking was the way in which global rankings were spoken about in the context of Europe's geopolitical goal, its status, and associated challenges. China, along with India, Japan, and Singapore, were identified as major competitors for international research and leadership, end quote, with questions being asked about Europe's preparedness. The final report made 4 references to rankings. The timing is particularly noteworthy. This was spring 2004. The Shanghai Academic Rankings, World Universities, our famous Shanghai rankings, had been produced the previous June by a relatively unknown Chinese university as an initial trial run for its own use. And yet it was already the key theme of the Irish Minister for Education and Science, Arnold Dempsey, who speaking in his capacity as the President of the European Council of Education Ministers. And he put the issue in context in his opening keynote to that event. He said, last year, the Shanghai Jiao Tong University's Institute of Education ranked the world's top 500 universities on academic and research performance. For the European Union, the news is not all that good. The study shows that 35 of the top 50 universities in the world are American. There was an immediate realization that while, as the final report stated, they were not yet accepted throughout the community, rankings were an indicator of growing global competition and accountability. In the wake of the Lisbon Agenda, subsequent EU communications have reinforced this theme, and you can see it just repeated continually. The EU concerns were matched by the German Ministry of Education, also in 2004, which described the situation in terms of, quote, we have a lot of very good universities across the board in Germany, a high average standard, but what we lack are really top universities. The latest ranking table clearly shows why it is that Germany needs top universities. A year later, in June 2005, the German government launched its Excellence Initiative, which has subsequently become a roadmap for government responses to international competitiveness around the world. A meeting in Dublin in 2006 heard Martin Cronin, then Chief Executive of Forfos, the Irish National Enterprise and Science Policy Research Agency, proclaim Ireland will have 2 universities in the top 20 by 2013. Well, I think this is 2017, but anyway. The French Senate in 2008 issued a report arguing its researchers were disadvantaged in favor of English-speaking institutions, and a conference organized under the auspices of the French presidency of the European Union championed the idea of a new EU ranking. And the rest, as they say, is history. Chaos theory provides a useful way to look at the influence of rankings, something I don't think many or any of us clearly or fully foresaw at the time. Coined by Lawrence, it's derived from the theoretical example of a hurricane's formation contingent on whether a distant butterfly flaps its wings several weeks earlier. So for something that began as an exercise associated with identifying key characteristics to help Chinese universities meet their own government's 985 policy, the Shanghai rankings became the unwitting bugler of global change. Over the years, there's been an avalanche of rankings. They are roughly divided into 4 main periods, each phase representing or reflecting social and political characteristics of their time, with some overlaps. So what Usher calls our prehistory, from let's say about 1900 to the 1950s, emphasized the schooling and characteristics of the birth of geniuses, or great men, no women. Phase 2, from about 59 to 2000, saw the rise of nationally based, commercially driven rankings in response to growing massification, student mobility, and the glorification of markets, signified by the emergence of the U.S. News and World Report college rankings, which began in 1983. Phase 3, starting in about 2003 with these Shanghai rankings, witnessed the arrival of global rankings in response to the intensification of globalization and global competition, and the strengthening of the international academic and professional labor market. Phase 4 sees the era of supranational rankings, spawning other and related initiatives in recognition that the internationalization of higher education, about which we talk a lot of, necessitates processes and guidelines to monitor and regulate transnational education provision and quality, academic mobility, and labor markets. Global rankings were initially dominated by the Shanghai, quickly followed by Times Higher Education in partnership with QS, and then Webometrics, all in 2004. The Leiden rankings and New Multi-Rank, which was the EU ranking, both were innovative in their own ways, the latter pioneering a multidimensional, user-oriented approach, which has subsequently been adapted and arguably surpassed by the major commercial players, although none has achieved any prominence beyond the common fascination with league tables. There's also been attempts to measure the performance of higher education systems. The Lisbon Council, QS does something, and Universitas 21. Times Higher and QS went their separate ways in 2009. US News and World Report re-entered the global rankings game in 2014, and the Times Higher has now joined with Wall Street Journal and created a US-based ranking starting in 2016, thereby signaling, at least to me, that US higher education was now firmly within the international landscape of higher education and no longer something seen apart. Today, there's probably over at least 150, if not more, nationalist and specialist rankings, and over 20 global rankings, although at the end of the day, only the Shanghai, the Times, and QS are referenced regularly. Both US News and Times rankings began life as adjuncts to their newspapers. Over the years, that relationship has been upturned to become less transparent. Indeed, the former US News is now best known for its rankings, and it's now ceased to be what was a weekly news magazine, with 80% of its visitors going directly to rankings. Others, such as QS, are openly commercial. The Shanghai group is now produced by the Shanghai Ranking Consultancy since 2009. But all of these together, their collective future success derives from their capacity to develop their comprehensive databases of higher education activity alongside other products and services. These highlight the growing expanse and influence of what could be called the global higher education intelligence business, providing a rich vein of monetized information, much of which we all give freely and pay to access. Ultimately, these initiatives are likely to foster the necessity for a common international data set, and whoever owns this data will certainly be in a commanding position. Despite ongoing criticism about rankings and the appropriateness or otherwise of the methodology, rankings are now widely perceived and used as the international measure of quality. The indicators chosen have been widely absorbed into policy speak and institutional planning, despite an extensive body of international research which questions their meaningfulness and rigor. Being in the top 100 is regularly interpreted as an aspiration and formulated as a national or institutional strategy, just as world class is now applied to almost every sector, from higher education to the workforce, to manufacturing to theater to restaurants, and of course to sport. And it's the subject of academic study. Indeed, the number of peer and non-peer reviewed articles, masters, doctoral theses, news commentary, online articles, websites, conferences, workshops, seminars, consultancies, and so on is testimony to the growing interest around this area. Today, there's almost 3 million entries on Google Scholar for university ranking, but over 95 million for world-class university on Google. Much of the commentary and analysis focuses on the technical and methodological aspects of rankings, including the choice of indicators, the weightings, the changing status of individual universities, countries, world regions, and so on. Indeed, watching rankings has become an international parlor game. But as William Locke, one of our own colleagues, contends, all things wrong with the rankings matter considerably less than the plain fact that the rankings matter. Reaction to rankings was initially strongest in Europe, but it's now evident worldwide. Students and their parents remain an important audience for rankings, but now all stakeholders, governments, employers, investors, potential higher education and business partners, ratings agencies, the public, the media, and so on, are all users in one way or another. Talk to the taxi cab driver when you're driving around, certainly in Dublin, when the rankings come out. Universities, of course, are one of the biggest users. The overwhelming majority of the institutions that I surveyed initially in 2006 and again in 2014 use rankings to inform strategic decisions, set targets, shape priorities, and inform decisions about international partnerships, even when most inappropriate. While most universities won't publicly admit it, 84% of surveyed institutions have a formal internal mechanism to review their institution's rank on a regular basis, most of this being done by the president or vice chancellor, indicating the seriousness with which it's taken. An EUA study, which I was involved in, European University Association, suggested universities are beginning to come to terms with rankings and use them as one of several institutional research tools rather than the sole source. But the International Student Barometer, produced by iGraduate, which receives feedback from almost 150,000 students in 28 countries, indicates that over 80% of undergraduate and postgraduate students, whether taught or research, have a high interest in rankings. It also shows that by 2014, reputational factors had displaced the quality of teaching as a significant factor influencing student choice. Indeed, quality of teaching no longer appears on the list of top 10 factors influencing choice. There are interesting differences as well as similarities according to world region. Developing countries use rankings to measure quality when external quality assurance processes are weak or non-existent, or as a gauge or symbol of global competitiveness and engagement with world science. However, rankings also encourage fanciful ambitions and timelines. Nigeria established a QA system with the aim of having at least 2 universities among the top 200 in world rankings by 2020. It's 2 of 200 of 2020 vision. As a part of its wider reform package, Vietnam aims to have 2 top-ranked universities by 2020. Because being world-class is a kind of a key factor for a BRIC or indispensable, the Indian government has worked closely with the major ranking companies with the intent to create 20 world-class universities, 10 from the public and 10 from the private sector, as it's given money there for in its 2016-2017 budget. Russia has devised its 5-100 program for the same reason, to ensure that it gets at least 5 universities in the top 100. However, probably one of my more disturbing recent conversations was with a Syrian university leader wondering why his university was not performing better than neighboring ones and what could he do to help. And had this whole story about why his particular university, I'm not going to mention it. But fanciful goals are found in Western universities also. The University of Kentucky in the States abandoned plans to reach its U.S. News and World Report Top 20, which is the goal there, by 2020, because doing so meant forsaking its mission as a land-grant university, but not before it had created a budgetary hole of $420 million. A similar tale is told at the University of Rochester, that realized that to move up just 2 points on the U.S. News scale would cost it $112 million. In 2013, Trinity College in Dublin toyed with the idea of changing its name, reclaiming the title of the University of Dublin, of which it's the only college, so it's the University of Dublin and Trinity, but ultimately abandoned the proposal due to unprecedented protest. Yale now feels compelled to engage with rankings, despite the fact that a few years ago it condemned them. And this may also help explain that, along with Brexit, may help explain Newcastle's decision to pursue global positioning rather than emphasize being a civic university. Thus, any thought or hope that national university reaction would temper with time has been greatly exaggerated, to paraphrase Mark Twain. So to talk now about reframing relationships. One, the history of ranking stretches back to the late 19th century, but it's the intensification of globalization that has been the most powerful force and explanation for their emergence and success since the turn of the millennium. Today, as the distribution of economic activity and scientific collaboration has become increasingly international, higher education has been transformed from a local institution into a global actor. It sits at the fulcrum of the geopolitical struggle for a greater share of the global market and the new world order. Thus, no longer simply part of national systems, it's an important part of the global economic architecture, with world-class universities in global cities playing a strategic role. Universities and colleges are critical to the sustainable social and economic development, sending out strong signals to mobile capital, business, and talent about the competitiveness of nations and regions. Across teaching and research, they operate increasingly as multi- and transnational entities seeking to maximize competitive advantage for themselves qua institutions and for their staff, students, and graduates qua elites. Globalization has facilitated increasing concentrations of wealth and resources, leading to an intensification of hierarchical differentiation and social stratification. The Academy has not been a disinterested participant in the process, benefiting from its close association with high-ranked, well-endowed, research-intensive elite universities. Rankings are an inevitable outcome and metaphor for the geopolitics of higher education, because they predominantly measure basic research and dissemination in what I would say limited fields and in a traditional way. They provide competitive advantage to elite universities and nations which benefit from accumulated public and private wealth and investment over decades, if not centuries. They reflect the structure of the world economy and global science. They are, as Cantwell argues, a report card on disparities in resources and the unevenness in the global production of knowledge, the effect of which is to legitimize such inequities. Rankings have succeeded in putting higher education into an international comparative framework and telling us something about competitive advantages for our institutions and our nations. Doing well in rankings has variously been described by the Russian Minister for Education and Science, Versenko, as equivalent to an instrument of competitive battle and influence, and by the Irish Times as, quote, a key factor in helping to attract inward investment. If, as Manuel Castells observed, higher education is the engine of the economy, then how it's governed and managed necessarily comes to the fore, along with matters of quality, performance, and productivity. So looking at relations within states. The earliest universities in Europe, dating back to the 13th century, were situated in leading cities and towns and closely linked to the local and political authorities, either the church or state. The emergence of modern science in the post-Renaissance era engendered a closer connection between the university and society, with new institutions underpinning the formation of the nation-state in Germany and France. Beginning in the 19th century, civic universities in the growing industrial cities of England and land-grant universities in the US, along with comparable examples in other parts of the world, were created to meet a growing and widening social and economic agenda. As the systems expanded in the latter 20th century, other types of institutions were established to meet a growing diversity of labor market and student needs. In most cases, the state has been the primary driver and facilitator of these developments. The relationship of higher education to society is strengthened over time and now forms a stronger part of government policy and correspondingly higher education's priorities. Academic autonomy has been an enduring principle, but so also has been the role of the university in society, formulated in terms of teaching, research, and public service or civic engagement. However, today as the debate about widening participation, employability and employment, and graduate attributes intensifies in many countries, the public is asking whether its interests or expectations are being served. U.S. surveys show public concerns about credential relevance and costs that are high on the agenda, with many people unhappy with levels of accountability. Studies and commentary in the US and UK suggest higher education is too self-serving rather than focused on providing a quality education. A Hefke study in 2010 noted public uncertainty about higher education's many functions and contributions. And just recently, just a month or so ago, just 12% of US university presidents said they, quote, strongly agree or agree that most Americans don't understand the purpose of higher education. Or sorry, that only 12% understand the purpose of higher education. 83% of European students in 2009 claimed that they would prefer independent reports on the quality of universities and programs, as these would help students to decide where to study. And almost everywhere there's a war of words about the quality of graduates, set against a decline in public trust in public institutions. There's probably three dimensions that underline concerns about quality. First, assessments required to show qualifications of a high quality or standard and internationally comparable and transferable. This is especially important in a globalized world in which students and graduates are mobile and employers recruit internationally. Second, governments or students or indeed other stakeholders are increasingly aware of getting value for money. For government, there's the added incentive of endeavoring to ensure it can get more for less by achieving what it regards as efficiencies, while for students it's the association with salary, career, and lifestyle. And third, massification, the surge in student demand and mobility has led to spectacular growth in the number of range of educational programs and providers, inter alia for-profit, transnational, cross-border, And there have been correspondingly a range of concerns about standards, accountability, unethical practices, and unethical promises, not least by the US president's own university, or former. I'm not quite sure what its status is anymore. Traditionally, the Academy has relied on peer review and international procedures of quality at the individual program or institutional level. Since the late 20th century, massification and globalization have begun to alter the relationship between higher education and the state. As an element of this, QA processes and practices have developed and expanded over the years. Burton Clark himself outlined 3 basic models. The European model, which traditionally was managed through state educational ministries, the US decentralized model through regional accreditors, and the British model, which recognized the role of self-accrediting universities, which is the model we have in Ireland. Recent years have witnessed, however, strong international convergence as academic self-regulation is overtaken by stronger emphasis on codification of practice and process, and a greater role for national governments and supranational agencies. In the US, QA has traditionally been the shared responsibility of what's called the triad, comprised of the federal government, regional accrediting agencies, and the state government, with the critical support with the support of the Academy. Over the years, there's been a shift from professional self-regulation to institutional processes arbitrated by these accrediting organizations to more recently the involvement of the federal government. One such example is the Obama administration's decision to establish the college scorecard, to, quote, hold colleges accountable for cost, value, and quality. Followed from the recommendations of the Spelling Commission on the Future of Higher Education 2006, established under the Bush administration. The latter's advocacy for greater federal involvement caused the American Council of Education, the counterpart to HEFCE, so to speak, maybe not quite. Universities UK might be a more appropriate comparator, to withhold support from the final report. To my mind, and even at the time, the adage of winning the battle but losing the war comes to mind. Recently, 3 Democratic senators led by Elizabeth Warren have proposed tightening up accreditation and strengthening accountability for students and taxpayers. Some of this coming in response to controversies over predatory practices by the for-profits and poor career prospects for students. This coincides with the review of accreditation practices that's been ongoing by the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, over the past, I'd say, 18 months. In the UK, professional self-regulation underpinned by a strong culture of external peer review has been a distinguishing characteristic of the system. External examining has been around since early 19th century. The move towards a unitary system, a single QA process was necessary, leading in 1997 to the QAA. Over the years, emphasis favored institutional reviews. However, the resulting reports were never intended for a public audience. They're usually difficult to decipher and unsuitable for measuring and comparing institutions and student performance. The TEF speaks to a range of needs and interests, including a more skeptical political system and public, and a diverse educational market. Around the world, an array of government-led initiatives has emerged, clearly influenced by the growing demand for internationally comparative data, a vital building block of a globalized landscape. Indeed, early justification for rankings and the usage were in response to the gap left by the insufficient publicly available information about higher education and the perception of the Academy's unwillingness to engage. Rankings have not been widely endorsed, but there are many examples of them directly and indirectly influencing decision-making, resource allocation, immigration criteria, etc. Macedonia and India have worked directly with rankings organizations, while Malaysia, Russia, France, and many others have embedded rankings as part of strategic objectives. Unistats, which operates here, in Australia, they also have QUILT. Catalonia, and many other countries, including also the US, have developed websites to make university statistics and performance open to public scrutiny. Policymaking by numbers is a pejorative way to describe the almost ubiquitous use of key performance indicators which frame decision-making and resource allocations. These trends are moving ahead at a significant pace, putting powerful new open source and social networking tools directly into the hands of applicants, consumers, and the public, and beyond the ability of the academy to affect or interpret the outcomes. Another development is the emergent role of international organizations, guidelines, and processes. Bologna emphasized trustworthy information and recognition of performance across Europe as a prerequisite for free movement of students, faculty, and workers. Copenhagen process sought to do similarly for European VET. The tuning project came about because of frustration that efforts to promote the European Credit Transfer System, the ECTS, was being hampered by a lack of recognition that students got when they went abroad, and they got no recognition when they came home. Initiatives such as UMAP were promoted as a profiling tool. Multirank developed in parallel with the OECD a HALO project, that's assessment of higher education learning outcomes, which was developed partially as an alternative to rankings. The OECD is currently developing a new system benchmarking project. The QA revolution, along with the whole alphabet soup of international organizations, has played a significant role in pushing the accountability agenda forward. These developments confirm a Rubicon being crossed. Quality is a contested concept, along with the role of quality assurance and how it's conducted and why. While higher education has traditionally been the primary guardian of quality, this role has effectively been usurped. The internationalization of higher education, the growth of a global professional labor market, the increasing presence of for-profit and transnational providers, and the link between higher education and economic recovery has transformed quality from something being institutionally led to be driven and regulated by the state, and now a critical part of the architecture of international higher education. Higher education's overarching importance for talent maximization and knowledge production has, as Simon Martinson has said, invited or necessitated greater steerage or, quote, over-regulation of academic output as performance. The accountability agenda is often described as part of a neoliberal, ideologically driven reform and restructuring of public services. Fairley and others argue that, quote, steering patterns can be linked to underlying narratives of public management reform, which apply to higher education subsystems as well as other public service systems. Neve says the desire to ensure more rapid responses from institutions of higher education to societal requirements led to a rebalancing of relations between higher education and the state, with implications for institutional autonomy. Some blame the academy. For example, Coates argues that universities should be among the most transparent institutions in the world, yet significant gaps remain about how to define or describe what they do and how their purpose is best conveyed to diverse audiences. Others accuse the academy of vacillating between inadequate involvement or commitment to the QA process. Calhoun chides the academy, saying it has been insufficiently engaged with the society upon whose support, both financial and moral, it depends. Whichever perspective is taken, what's clear is that the priorities are being set increasingly by governments through national strategies or performance agreements. The engagement agenda with its own raft of indicators is part of this trend, providing a mechanism whereby societal objectives influenced by government, business, and civil society shape HE priorities. In different ways and in different national contexts, policy reforms have sought to reformulate the social contract, leading to changes in coordination, including government. Whereas historically the state provided for the needs of universities, today the university provides for the needs of the state. in reframing these relationships. In this way, I think it's too simplistic to lay the origins of the blame for relations between states. The current phase of globalization is part of a historic continuum of mobility of people, capital, and services. But even before the 2008 global crisis and subsequent Great Recession, OECD countries were facing challenges associated with competition for investment capital and what's called the battle for brainpower or the war for talent. Relative differences in levels of investment have enabled a huge shift in the composition of the global talent pool and in R&D, reflecting the growing value-based and knowledge intensiveness of economic competition between nations and regions. The OECD expects that over the next 50 years, changes in the world order are likely to intensify as the economic balance shifts towards emerging economies, particularly those in Asia, with the share in the world GDP of non-OECD countries rising well beyond that of the current OECD area by 2060. In previous decades, OECD countries competed with countries that offered low-skilled work at low wages, and the EU, Japan, and the US dominated science and technology. This is changing. It's no longer simply jobs that are moving, but know-how and high-value work. Recent years have seen the rapid expansion of R&D performance in East, Southeast, and South Asia. Representing only 25% of global R&D in 2001, these two regions now, their share is now 34% by 2011. China has exhibited the most dramatic R&D growth patterns. Along with Singapore, Malaysia, South Korea, and the Gulf countries, these countries aim to challenge the primacy of the US and Europe by establishing global hubs with higher education and research at their heart. For decades, the US had the world's highest tertiary graduation rate, enabling it to supply about a third of today's 55 to 64-year-old graduates across the world's major economies. Today, that rate is shrinking due to the relative growth in other countries. As college education becomes less accessible and affordable in the US, and European countries face budgetary challenges, other countries are moving ahead. Massification is transforming these economies and the universities and underpinning the expansion of a new middle class, 2/3 of which will reside in Asia by 2030. By then, China and India could account for more than 60% of STEM graduates in the G20 area, with Europe and the US providing a mere 8% and 4% respectively. Internationalization is moving to what Gallagher and Garrett refer to as its third phase. Traditionally focused on cultural exchange and exemplified by student and academic national priorities are conjoined around matters such as talent recruitment, the graduate diaspora, innovation, and trade. Like other transnational enterprises, universities are global players, seeking to maximize competitive advantage for themselves as institutions and their nations. Their global operations are promoted and consolidated through recruitment missions, transnational provision, and international networks. Claims, higher education is explicitly and fundamentally a global enterprise. The interconnectedness of the global economy and labor markets has necessitated greater international controls and regulation, underpinning questions around perception and assessment of quality. We have issues of mutual recognition of academic qualifications and credentials, internationalization and student, graduate, and professional mobility, issues around transnational education and cross-border providers, and quality assurance and systems and provision. An alphabet soup of international and supranational organizations and associations have established new multilateral governance arrangements to respond to this complex global environment. Previously mentioned OECD System Benchmarking Initiative aims to re-engage the organization with global higher education in the wake of the collapse of the Institute of Management of Higher Education program in 2015, which Mike and I were involved with. UNESCO is pushing ahead with its Global Convention of Higher Education, falling upon regional conventions to coincide with its 2020 World Congress. And we have a whole slew of other international players, not least the British Council, who's quite active, the Qatar Foundation, and others. Robinson et al. Suggest that these actions reflect a degree of ceding authority and sovereignty. However, it's also, as McGuinness argues, an acknowledgement of the inadequacy at the institutional and national level for addressing the internationalization of knowledge and the worldwide movement of students and scholars. A web of top-down, bottom-up, soft and hard structures and processes is being created. Again, the Bologna process is a good example of this complexity. It represented a significant move to bring coherence to otherwise disparate national systems and make European higher education more competitive internationally. The call for greater coordination around QA and cross-border provision is also coming from and being led by higher education representative associations themselves. Similar initiatives are at an earlier stage of development in Asia, Africa, and South America. Transnational capitalism builds and utilizes global knowledge production networks, enabling higher education to access the best resources and talent on a global scale. Students and faculty both gain, acquiring additional and/or further consolidating private benefit and social capital, while garnering and boosting their own prestige in the labor market. Rankings provide a gateway. Students attending top-ranked universities constitute a tiny percentage of overall students. 70% of surveyed higher education leaders said that rankings influence the willingness of other institutions to partner with them, and 45% believe rankings influenced other institutions to partner with them. As one university president noted, ranking results may not be the crucial factor in forming partnerships, but they grease the wheels. As nations compete on their knowledge and innovation systems, higher education plays a key role in reframing relationships between states as it's transformed from a predominantly social institution with local or subnational remit to being the cornerstone of economic policy with geopolitical responsibilities. Research excellence continues to be concentrated in the US and Europe, but developed countries are finding it difficult to maintain their competitive position. For countries dependent upon attracting talent, especially in S&T, science and technology, new immigration policies in both the UK are likely to aggravate this gap. These developments help explain the rise in fascination with global rankings. Their success is tied to mapping patterns of investment and outcomes, especially across the biosciences and technology, thereby signaling disparities in capacity and capability. But ultimately, rankings are a lag indicator. They're reflecting changes which have already occurred. So reflecting on Burton Clark. Better hurry up here. So Clark's triangle of coordination represented a major advance in our thinking about higher education governance and authority. Drawing on international comparisons, he identified three ideal types: the state system, market, and professional system, to form the basis of 2- and 3-dimensional spaces for comparing national systems. In each ideal type, he described approaches to oversight, coordination, and interrogation of tensions. The paradigm becomes a triangle coordination when the academic hierarchy is introduced. And over time, there were shifts in coordination patterns. As the system expands and pressure arises for more and better higher education, it gives rise to a different range of providers with differentiated roles. Governance arrangements become more complex. We have a range of external groups, trade unions, other recognized representative groups, educational and scientific elites, and so on. HE becomes subjected to what may be called power markets, or markets composed of units struggling one against one another within a broad framework. Market-type behavior begins to overshadow other circumstances as institutions jockey for position and status. This encourages prestige thinking as a defining characteristic of academic behavior. The key attribute of Clark's model is that it sought to move discussion of higher education beyond transactional relationships to embrace a complex dynamic between the forces of the state, the market, and the academy. His triangle, Marginton and Rhodes argue, provides a heuristic for studying, comparing, and classifying national systems. However, the coordination Clark described was understandably, given its timing, largely focused on dynamics within a single state and within the university. Since then, various people have sought to move the analysis forward, recognition of new dynamics, topics such as globalization, regionalism, marketization, knowledge society and innovations, ecosystem, managerialism, and accountability. It's difficult to ignore the fact that the expanse of social, economic, political, and ideological change over recent years has had implications for public policy about higher education. While nation-states remain the primary feeding and breeding ground for higher education, institutes operate increasingly within a multidimensional, multi-level, multilateral paradigm. There are competing demands from local, national, and global levels, and a more diverse range of constituencies and publics. Indeed, there are conflicts between these groups, most notably organs of the state are forever fighting with each other. Some of this is associated with the complexity of decision-making and massification of systems. But there's also changes in the expectations around the social contract, the role and purpose of higher education in and for society and the economy. As Trowell noted, as the system expands in terms of students and providers, matters of higher education come to the attention of larger groups of people in and out of government who have other quite legitimate ideas about where public funds should be spent, and if given to higher education, how they should be spent. Various terms have evolved to explain these changing relationships between the triple, quadruple, and quintuple helix, innovation systems, national innovation systems, mode 1, mode 2, mode 3, and so on, all of which attempt to explain these changing dynamics. This suggests that government has become an even more complex landscape than Clark envisaged. Paraphrasing Scott, the accountability agenda corresponds to this current phase of state-societal relations, requiring new and different modes of coordination. But global factors also have become significant and have implications for higher education as well as for governments and national and global organizations. Pursuit of talent and knowledge, productive capacity and capability is mutually codependent with access to and involvement with mobile talent, services, and products. Robinson argues higher education is being drawn into the logic of capitalist expansion and world market making. This is certainly true, but a globalized economy has certain prerequisites around mobility flows, recognition of credentials and quality assurance, standard setting and guidelines, data definition and collection, and so on, without which the international higher education about which we speak often cannot function. Developments mutually derive from and support both higher education and government requests and requirements for tools and processes that can enable and support greater expansion and smoother integration. So to my final observations. Thus far, I've been discussing the changing interface between higher education and the state, and have also considered the extent to which it's altered since Burton Clark first wrote. The common denominator is increasing complexity and interaction between local, national, and global factors and levels of engagement, which obliges us to revisit and re-examine Clark's triangle. So I want to conclude by making 4 points. First, let's not let ranking. Higher education's foremost role in talent maximization and knowledge production makes it integral to national and global power relations. There's also a strong affinity between higher education's own eagerness and arguably its necessity to perform well internationally and the state's necessity to promote and capitalize on higher education for competitive advantage. While competition has accelerated between nations and universities, for a greater share of the global marketplace, pursuance of world-class status is a shared strategy of transnationalizing elites. Transnational networks form a necessary function in strengthening position within the global knowledge value chain. Rankings are an important tool in this regard, which explains why nations and universities both use rankings as a benchmark of success. We're accustomed with the way in which governments have unashamedly used rankings to shape policy, strategy, resource allocation, and so on. But we should also recognize university and academic behavior. Allegations of gaming often just deflect attention from the bigger problems associated with rankings. But we must acknowledge that higher education institutions are not innocent and use rankings in varying ways for various purposes to strengthen their value proposition by restricting access to positional goods, such as credentials. Rankings reflect and map this changing dynamic. Looking beyond its technical, mechanical characteristics, which we've all come to love and hate, rankings have a hegemonic role, framing and reframing the relationships of higher education to the state and society. While higher education is distinctly national, rankings have successfully challenged their nation-boundedness and have helped restructure the rules of engagement, exposing the codependence between the economy, knowledge, and talent. Rather than seeing higher education as an innocent victim, universities and their faculty have become global actors constructing and extending their own sphere of influence in a competitive, hierarchically differentiated status system. Second, there's little doubt that rankings have coincided with the necessity for closer scrutiny of quality, performance, and productivity. But the accountability agenda is not simply, as I said before, a manifestation of what we love to hate, neoliberalism. Yes, there's underpinning ideological drivers which have seeded deep questioning about the role and purpose of public good-facing organizations. But as massification and global competition accelerates and the reputation arms race heats up, it's evident that no government can or will be able to afford all the higher education citizens demand or society requires. Usher argued that the maximum point of public investment in higher education was probably reached around 2009. It's also fair to say that we often make too much of the tensions between state governance and institutional autonomy, and that, as Calhoun argues, higher education needs to reaffirm or affirm its commitment to the public good in a way that goes beyond simply making a simple correlation between what it does, teach and research, and societal benefit. The public voice, which was largely absent from Clark, has asserted itself in a demonstrable and vocal way, and not always to our liking. In ways which are becoming evident, these changes highlight also the extent to which the university has become isolated from its many publics. Thus, as these new constituencies, such as students, business, enterprise, civil society, and so on, each of which are heterogeneous, operate alongside national and global determinants, there's an obligation to rethink the way higher education is organized, as well as how it is steered, led, and managed. Policy, provision, funding, and organization are a very different proposition when participation is near universal. These developments are changing the relationship between higher education and the state in very profound ways, and there is unlikely to be a return to what we might have wished us, the golden age. If I may be controversial here, maybe I have or not, many of the reforms being pursued now are both necessary and inevitable, and arguably late in coming. Third, higher education is part of a wider geopolitical landscape. Universities and elite universities in particular, along with their students and staff, have benefited despite all the controversies and all the roaring about education as an internationally traded service. In fact, most of that happened after the door had already, the horse had bolted. The demand for evidence of contribution and impact is arguably a response to its own claims that higher education is the driver of the economy. The government and public have simply called their bluff. Clark acknowledged the power of reputation, prestige as defining characteristics, spearheading differentiation within a market-based system. But his writings predated the surge in global rankings and their influence on institutional and national policy. As people know, I'm a strong critic of rankings. Their methodology is unsuitable, the indicators are insufficiently meaningful, and the data is unreliable. But this has not stopped them from being used and adopted by governments and universities around the world in order to maintain and boost their presence. One of the significant outcomes of the ranking discourse, whether we agree with them or not, is that they provide some form, it's debatable what form, but some form of accountability. And in so doing, rankings have reframed the way higher education interacts with the state at a national and global level. And finally, fourth, to return to the role of higher education in society. A big lesson of rankings is the extent to which higher education policy has become vulnerable to an agenda set by others, in this case, indicators by commercial ranking companies. Rankings promote the cryptocurrency of world-classness. The results and their advocates promulgate the view that they hold the secret recipe if only governments and universities would align themselves more closely with the indicators. Success in world science is usually based around concentration of talent and resources, but critics argue that such strategies can undermine national economic capacity, amplifying the benefits of global cities while undermining regional towns and widening the privilege gap. Pursuit of excellence is measured in terms of achievements of individual universities rather than the system or society collectively. In other words, it promotes world-class universities rather than world-class systems. For people in developed or OECD countries, the underlying belief was that each generation would be better off than the previous one, that progress was a birthright. But at a time when higher education is in growing demand, more people feel left behind, struggling to live up to societal and personal expectations. Unequal distribution of societal goods has been accompanied by perception that the rest of the world is doing better. We are competing now with cities and countries with most of us never knew of or considered a few years previously, generating a deep sense of grievance. Higher education has, as I said, historically had a close relationship with the city and country of its founding, but today it's considered part of the elite, with campuses viewed as islands of affluence amid seas of squalor, violence, and despair. Colleges that have prided themselves on working across borders of country and culture now find themselves in opposition with governments which want to keep out foreigners. Education mobility, even within the country, have appeared as fault lines in voting behavior. The UK here in 2016, US in its election, and most recently in France, as well as elsewhere. Look at the maps, my phrase is mind the gap. Many fundamental values of higher education, cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism, international collaboration, free flow of ideas, of people and idea, broadly social liberal values, pursuit of truth, are perceived as threatening. These deepening social cultural cleavages help explain the rise of popular social political reaction, which is likely to become a feature of our society over the coming decades. It's true that societal problems are not the sole responsibility or result of higher education, but higher education's hands are not clean. Disturbingly, many universities have become civically disengaged, to use Putnam's term. They've transformed themselves into self-serving private entities, less engaged or committed to their nation or region, as they eagerly pursue their world-class position and shout about the public good. The public's interest is being confused with private self-interest. The implicit social contract is in trouble. This is creating a vacuum, pushing the state, often controversially, to step back in, to reassume a stronger coordinating role, to reaffirm the public good by ways of national strategies, frameworks, and funding mechanisms. We sit at a historic junction, one in which higher education has the opportunity and responsibility to play a critical role in rebuilding a shared sense of societal purpose and identity. To be effective, it needs to move away from arguments of self-interest and victimhood. It's not just about what happens on campus or grandstanding about how great the university is or what it does for society. Rather, there's an onus on universities and colleges of all missions to rethink and reshape relations with its publics and the state, and to reorient itself as an anchor institution alongside its students, staff, and graduates, and a wider community, and as an intellectual force to bridge the gap between the local, national, and global. There is no time for complacency. Thank you.
Well, Ellen has given us a very thought-provoking lecture. We have quite a bit of time for questions and discussion, and let me assure you that she'll be very pleased to answer any questions and points you may like to put. Please, there is a microphone to assist you.
Ellen, thank you for a wonderful, comprehensive, I think, description of the higher education sector globally, nationally, and where it's at. It's also, of course, as your last passages showed us, changing quickly. The pushback against globalisation raises questions about the impact and role of rankings. I mean, I think you're right to say that globalisation has provided conditions for ranking, and ranking has furthered globalisation in higher education and maybe socially more generally. It's certainly made global status very important in this sector, and because this sector is central to many people's lives, it's made global status more important more generally. Do you think that's changing now? I mean, the pushback is splitting these Atlantic country polities right down the middle. It's hard to imagine that the uncritical receipt of rankings as they've been will go on. Have you seen any sign of a change?
Well, I've seen no sign of change on the, well, let me rephrase that. At times I think I do see some more questioning position. I think it's not coherent. So yes, I see some and then I see none. I see some at one stage. I thought certainly a couple of years ago there was more, particularly from countries that the world-class pursuit was not really credible, but also from others. So I gathered a group of what I call jurisdictions, because they weren't all individual states, to a meeting we had in Dublin. And it was really interesting, a whole range of, tended to be small or smaller countries, but all largely interested in looking at the growing problems that massification were bringing because of the numbers of students, and also the sheer realization that you can't win this. You can't win it, So the basic question I would ask at one stage is, have you costed your ambition? And clearly those examples of Kentucky and Rochester are a good example. So yes, there are those examples of countries that are now beginning to look at different ways and beginning to look at systems and how that works and how we are actually going to manage to get more and more participation and numbers of people through the system. I expect, as someone said to me, well, once, it's all very well, we have a choice. We don't educate people and they stay, or we educate people and they leave. What's your choice? I mean, we are going to have more and more, the participation rates are going to increase. They don't go backwards. And therefore, in the Irish case, we're looking at over 60% participation rates already in higher education. And I'm really trying to get people to think, look, you really need to be thinking by 2040, you're looking at, 70, 80% at least. more. I mean, you know, you've written on universal participation, absolutely. Universalization and a changing dynamic of higher education. So this raises lots of fundamental questions that does challenge the idea of rankings, but the rankings tell us something else as well. And we can't, that's why I say they tell us something, and that is something, it tells us how we operate in an increasingly international world, and we can't pull back from that either.
Thank you, Fiona Ross Leadership Foundation. That was an amazing talk. Thank you, Ellen. I just wanted to come back to your point about the ambivalence that there is expressed by universities about ranking. Universities love to hate them, but actually they get off on them big time. And I think you talked about that. And you described it as a sort of self-serving. And in some ways, perhaps, we're living with the consequences now of universities, certainly in the UK and the US, being isolated from their publics. So what I'm interested in is on the one hand, rankings drive performance and productivity and behaviour of people. I'd really like you to say more about the behaviour, because I think vice-chancellors are hired and fired on the success or not of their league table position. Academic staff are increasingly being forced to work very much as individuals and not collegially. And I think we know that the sort of the team underpinning of research produces the best research, not just individuals doing their own thing. So I just wondered if you could say a bit more about the actual, at the micro level, what we know about the impact of rankings on people and behaviour.
Sure, thanks, Fiona. Yeah, I mean, I've done quite a bit of work on this, and there's some other interesting, there's lots of interesting people doing research looking at the impact, and they all broadly show the same thing. Though I would temper it slightly to say, are they due to rankings or because we're operating in an increasingly more competitive environment? So they're kind of hand in glove. But certainly we see issues about tightening up of strategy and positioning. But if you weren't doing that, you're not really going to survive. So tightening up of strategy and positioning, tying rankings to resource allocation, to looking at it in terms of changing and reorganization within the university. Obviously, one of the things that people often point to is mergers, particularly mergers between universities that will benefit each other. So there's an awful lot of due diligence that goes on behind the scenes before you consider the merger. It's a bit like looking at being betrothed and wondering whether or not they're going to come with a good dowry or not. And that's really the factor, and it has been a feature working both ways. But you also see it in the reorganization of systems. So what might be called traditional Russian or Soviet system, where you had universities which were predominantly teaching in separate research institutes, you see a lot of those mergers coming about because of the fact that what's being measured are universities. So if you want to start disaggregating that, which you might do in order to get better results out of your research institutes, particularly those that are commercially focused, it's not going to play well in an investment sense because your universities will be cut off. So it's a really interesting conundrum of how you drive policy and how you don't. It has to do certainly with appointments, both on faculty and students. We see a lot of game playing around student entry criteria, what's called the Selectivity Index in the US scenario. If you over-offer then you've got a huge demand, but you only select a few, it shows that you must be fantastic because all these people want to come. So there's a load of things that go on. A lot of it driven by precisely in order to get yourself up the rankings, because a lot of things fall off the back of it. And this is where vice chancellors and presidents are caught to a very large extent. It may have to do, if you're in the US, it may have to do with your state budget. It may have to do with presidents and their contracts. We've seen that here. We've seen that in Australia. It has to do with local investors. It has to do in general with investment. The quote I read was from the Irish Times, in which there's always this bemoaning of what's happening at Ireland. Oh, you know, things are bad, they're falling down the rankings and so on. What are we going to tell, you know, for an economy that lives off foreign direct investment? These factors are really quite important. For a country like India, being a BRIC is a really difficult place to be if you don't have a world-class university. It's not, you know, they go hand in hand because of what they measure in terms of your performance in what I would say world science, broadly S&T, but say knowledge, research in general. So they have had a really difficult role. I expect the more pernicious side of it is that the ranking organizations themselves are big business. They cultivate a huge consultancy. People go along to their meetings, of which they charge a fortune. You go down in the rankings and they're there on your doorstep to sell you a chip as how you could rise in the rankings. So there is, you know, there's all kinds of game playing being had with it. And that's what I mean when I said that one of the important lessons is how policy is being driven by external factors. And who's driving your policy and what is it reflecting and what are the objectives? And we see that across the board.
Rose McDean, Royal Holloway. I think that's absolutely fascinating about what you said. I think that there's a sense in which one of the problems that universities are facing is that on the one hand they're increasing the participation rate, but on the other hand they're also, if they're actually going to reinvent themselves in terms of the kind of local and regional mission, then the question is what kind of universities are actually going to do that? Because it seems to me that a lot of the universities heavily engaged in the rankings are not going to be in a position to produce any kind of organisational structure which is going to allow them to do that. So then perhaps we have to look at alternative ways of organising universities which may not be completely outside the mainstream. And do you think that's realistic? Because if it isn't, it seems the whole thing is moving in a direction in which it will be completely tied up in knots because there'll be higher and higher percentage of young people in higher education, but actually still everyone else will think they're an elite. So ironically, when it really was an elite system, people didn't perceive it as an elite system. Now it isn't, people do. So there's a real paradox there. And the question is, who's going to move out of that? And how are they actually going to do it?
I expect that's really the big issue. I mean, this is where you're looking at it, well, lots of things to say, but I mean, this is why I pose that question as to whether or not, to some extent, you see now the state or the government's now moving back in, because whether we like them or not, we see increasingly governments using varying instruments, whether it's TEF is a kind of a mild version of above performance indicators or systems or compacts, and we see compacts across Europe and so on. We have them. In the Irish case, as a means of mediating the role of higher education in return for national objectives. And some of these national objectives are about international positioning. I mean, one of the biggest groups in what I would call trade missions is higher education. I mean, they are first and foremost one of the biggest groups out there. That's why I said all this stuff about GATS and traded services. I wouldn't believe a word of it. They're out there, and at the moment there is lots of discussion going on at very senior levels between UK and US universities in order to maximize positioning. That's what all these international networks are about. It's about accessing other research funds and other students and sharing talent and so on. And wouldn't you do that? I mean, don't multinationals do that? So how do we develop come back to a system where we've got a greater sense of engagement? And some of that is going to, I think, end up being driven by government funding. And the government's going to have to do some of that because you have large portions of countries being effectively increasingly isolated. I was in Iowa just a week after the US elections and showed up the map, the University of Iowa, and there you see it. One small map in the rest of the state, and that's replicated. The Chronicle of Higher Education did a really interesting mapping exercise of votes and so on. But it also reflects wider socioeconomic problems. And these are the kinds of issues that society as a whole and governments as a whole are going to have to look at. I think there is a role for higher education to relook at its position as to how it balances these. I don't think it's a question of saying, you do that and we'll do this, because I don't think that works. There's also an interesting study that was done of the North Carolina Triangle, which has been always mooted as being one of these really interesting innovation hubs where we've got the three of them all working together, well, that's great. The Triangle has done really well, but not the rest of the state. So these are these really big questions of what do we mean by national innovation systems and how do we get really important spillover effects that go beyond the groups that are involved in it. And it's a question beyond higher education, but certainly involves higher education.
There are two people, Heather first and then behind.
Yes, Heather Eggins, Sussex and Staffordshire at the moment. At the end of your lecture, which I enjoyed very much, and thank you for that, you call upon the higher education institutions to concentrate much more on their relations with the public and with the state. I actually would argue that many of our universities here, and I'm only speaking for the UK at this point, are doing exactly what they can in that regard. And if you go to the different universities, and I was on the council of one which does a huge amount of work with its community in as many ways as it can, and also many, because of the Brexit arrangement that we are now plunged into, the vice-chancellors are spending enormous hours and effort in actually talking to ministers of state, and in fact last week one of them that I was speaking to had a meeting with Theresa May the week before. And I'm wondering, do you think that what has happened is that there has been a shift in the attitude of states towards higher education? And our state, I think we could argue quite strongly, no longer prioritizes higher education. It can't get in its place in the queue that it used to be able to. What do you think?
Well, there's no doubt higher education is a hard sell. I mean, let's be frank about it. Other than if I wanted to deal with a lot of problems around access and inequality, I wouldn't start with higher education. I'd be putting my money in preschool. And that's, higher education is a hard sell after the, health service and public transport and social services, pensions, it's a hard sell for a group that is generally seen to be relatively well off, or certainly as graduates can pay for it. So I think it struggles to find a place in the queue. Having said that, it's absolutely intrinsic to any government's economic strategy. It can't function without it, though it tends to differentiate between higher education as the teaching side and the S&T innovation, the RDI side. So they get disaggregated, and we see that also in the way in which they're often run by different ministries, and the ministries always fighting with each other as to who controls it. So I think it's a mixed bag around higher education, but there's certainly, I would say, almost everywhere a concern that higher education is not, there's a lack of trust in it. There's always these concerns about its graduates, the quality of the graduates. And that just seems to be increasingly universal. I think one of the things, it isn't just about higher education widening participation and getting involved in small level projects. It's the level of the overall involvement in what I would use this term as kind of within the innovation system, where there are harder structures, what I would say, not just casual meets, but harder alliances that you can form with local governments, with civil society in a way that reaches out into the region, that has a wider remit, that looks at a shared vision for the area. Universities have their own vision, but that's not necessarily the region's mission. And there are examples of where this is happening in varying places. There's some interesting examples also in Spain and other countries. And there are ways, I think, that this can be done, but it's a much more holistic approach by the institution to engage in this with its partners in a much more cohesive and comprehensive way, rather than on one-to-one individual little projects. I mean, I'm not sure that the individual projects are what people do, and we had them in my university as well. I kind of called it the Vincent de Paul side of the university. I'm not quite sure that is really sufficient. Even internationalization, where all your students, the students go, only a fraction of them go, but the rest of the state, who cares? So what are you doing about bringing the benefits of internationalization back home? And I don't mean to the campus.
Next question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ellen. Miguel Lim, University of Manchester. Wow, so many points. Thank you for all of them. Just pick on a couple. You mentioned earlier in the lecture the importance or the role or the trend around global higher education information businesses. I mean, higher education information businesses, and then later on, much later on, you spoke about world-classness as a cryptocurrency. And I think those really provocative and really interesting ideas about the role of, you might say, this kind of new capitalism in this space. And the state plays a big role in your lecture, but could you comment a little more on the regulation of this kind of capitalism, this higher education information business, or the cryptocurrency of world-classness, and how the state regulates this? A bit of my own work studying these businesses suggested to me that it was a sort of like a free-for-all land grab, and that the state was regulating universities much more than ranking organizations. And what could you say about that?
Well, I don't think we know. Okay, so the first thing that I'm talking about in the first instance is about this growth in monetized HE data. I mean, it's a huge industry. We might be looking at scientific data, which we've been looking at for a long time. But certainly, and there's a lot of buying and selling now going in within this space. Between Thomson Reuters, Times is now expanding in that range, so has Shanghai. Multirank has just come out and says we have the largest database of HE data in the world. The EU has set up ITER. US, I mean, eventually there's a lot of movement in this space. There's a lot of expensive data. what's always been kind of somewhat humorous is the fact that we all give our data free because we want to be part of these systems, and then we buy it back. And getting access or membership in any of these things are really quite important in terms of benchmarking and anything else. So this is a growing part of a business. It's used by not just companies, but rating agencies, investment companies who want to put in. Banks use it. They want to know where the credit worthiness of universities is, or where in fact that they're advising others. And because higher education is one of the key infrastructures of the state, I mean, it may not be top of the policy of, people may think they're being overlooked, but it is one of the key infrastructures. It's come from being the social side of service, along with social welfare payments and health, into the center of economic policy. That's why it sits in economic ministries often. That's why it sits in all those, because it is fundamentally now part and parcel of it. And I think we're going to see a lot more movement in that regard. That is that control over the data. I think one of the key difficulties at the moment is that we do not have an agreed common data set. We don't have common data definition. We don't even have that within the same country often. What constitutes a student is a really contentious issue in many systems. Because we can't work out where that is, and governments attempt to do that, but the institutions themselves are busy trying to maneuver the numbers around. That's why using staff-student ratio as a measure of anything is completely meaningless, because you don't know what it's about. But we all use it. Well, I certainly say that it's unworthy. But so that is, I think, an increasing source. Whoever controls that data over time will be in a really important place. The UN UNESCO has been in this space, and obviously OECD has been in this space as well. So that's the kind of thing. And what I'm really saying by it is that it's an essential ingredient of an internationalized higher education system. We can't actually we talk about international higher education, but in order to operate, it requires an architecture that underpins it. We can't have graduates moving around the place if their qualifications aren't recognized, which is essentially what the EU is about. We can't, there's a whole load of things that we have difficulties doing unless we've got some commonalities around it. And the data set, I think, is something that's going to come up. That's what a halo was about. It fell, but I think these things will come back on the agenda.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Johnny Rich. I wanted to pick up on one of the things about the interplay between competition and rankings. You mentioned that in response to Fiona's question. Normally when markets become more competitive, different suppliers want to differentiate and become more distinctive and have their own USPs in order to find a niche within the market. But that happens when people can identify their own need and what it is they want from the service. And they can define for themselves, to some extent, what good looks like. The problem here is that the league tables have replaced any common notion of, or any personal notion of good, of what's good for me, with a common idea of good that, as you have pointed out, and Baron Becker-Adnier and many others have pointed out, is an utterly flawed notion based on very narrow criteria, poorly measured, and then subsequently put through very spurious methodologies. And so you end up with a very narrow idea of what good looks like, and universities, in order to claim quality, end up chasing a monoculture. And in fact, what we need to try and find is a way of generating this diversity in the system And league tables utterly undermine that diversity and create a monoculture. Well, whereas how can we undermine this? How can we subvert this to create, to put back in the diversity?
Well, I saw your piece the other day looking at U multi-rank, and obviously it's tried, but it's not really going to get there. Yeah, I think one of the difficulties also has to do with the fact that, as I said in the piece, is that we had this view that everyone was going to get on and succeed, and this idea that we were going to do better than our parents. The increasing competition within the labor market is also driving up attention around elite institutions. We all want to be elite. I mean, look at, we're all chasing these handbags and these ridiculous other items, and they're copycats. And the elite has become incredibly sought after, no matter what it is. Credentials are incredibly important in terms of ownership. Indeed, arguably, that's the only thing universities have that retain their position in the market is the credential, and that itself is now coming under threat, i.e. by increasing numbers of providers. So the whole sphere in which higher education has operated and called its own is now hugely up for grabs. There is increasing diversity. There is an extraordinary diversity within the higher education system and internationally. It's just we focus on a very small number of them. So this standard mantra, you know, about 18,000 institutions, and we focus on 100. You know, if we looked at, what is it, the Russell Group in Oxford here, only 9% of students go to it. If we looked in the US, what was my figures? In the US, less than 1% attend highly selective universities, you know, such as Harvard and Yale. Yet the New York Times has given overwhelmingly more attention to a small number than it has to 50% to the community colleges, which take in 50% of the students. So the way in which we look at what constitutes these wider issues is in fact a huge, obviously it's a huge issue. It's not just an HE issue, but there are big, you know, no simple answers, but a huge issue about how we reconstruct and go back to looking at the role of systems and how we deal with that. And I think that is a way to do it, because you're looking increasingly at the capacity overall. And you set national objectives, and this is where I end up coming back to this issue about national objectives and so on, and a shared vision of whether that's at a subnational level. I don't mean small cities, I mean larger regions, or we set them at national levels where we have a shared sense of a vision and objectives of what the society is seeking to achieve. And I expect that's a question I would start off all the time. I mean, what are you seeking to achieve? What's your objectives here? And how are you going to get there? But there's no doubt about it that if in an international environment, we are looking increasingly for ways in which we can compare ourselves. And at the end of the day, qualitative text-based QA reports are not going to do it. This is a real conundrum. There are lots of initiatives around trying to find different ways of measuring. I genuinely think that most governments are keen to do that. I think in many cases they lack the idea about how to do that, and obviously there are political forces and so on. But I think, by and large, I think policymakers are genuinely interested in ideas that would help them solve a problem. I think most academics spend their time grandstanding or criticizing them on the sidelines, and the academy has not gotten involved. It's what I would generally respond to people and say, start driving the bus.
If there are no more questions, Simon.
Well, thanks, Mike, for indulging me. And it's perhaps the obvious question arising from your presentation, but do you think there is scope to develop a comparative ranking based on civic engagement or the social or public mission of the universities? I mean, really a rigorous attempt to devise workable data. I'm not talking about QS doing it, tricking it up. I mean, I'm talking about a serious attempt.
I think there's a serious attempt to try and put something together. I think there have been a lot of initiatives in this space. It comes back to my other point about the common database. I mean, definitions, a lot of the stuff is really murky to look at, hard to measure, easier at a national level than it is internationally. The kinds of stuff that ends up being thrown in there for engagement tend to be things like patents, which are completely meaningless, or other kinds of things of that sort, very difficult to actually get your hands around. And that has really been, I think, a lot of the stumbling block. But certainly, I mean, you have the experience of U-Multirank, which tried in that vein and has been, with all due respect to it, it's a good idea. A lot of its ideas have now been copied by the others, but it has not really put the world on fire. So it's really, where do we go from here? And I think it does call for that conversation.
Well, having given Simon his second question, do you have another one, Simon? I think we should draw the lecture to a close. I'd like to say thank you on your behalf to Ellen, who's given us the most wide-ranging and interesting presentation. We can now, having saluted Ellen in the normal way, there are drinks outside for those who want to continue the conversation. Ellen, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.